Hello everyone and welcome. In this video sponsored by Hyundai, we are talking about whether front-wheel drive cars can make for good sports cars. And I think this is a great example, one of the best modern examples that illustrates, yes, they absolutely can. So we're going to be talking about, what does make for a good sports car, ultimately something that has a purpose for, driving enjoyment. It exists to be enjoyable to drive, and there's a level of performance associated with it, handling, performance, and just overall has that joy to drive. And so I want to talk about kind of the challenges associated with front-wheel drive and why it is challenging to make a good front-wheel drive sports car, but also, how it can be done in some of the engineering solutions in vehicles like this Veloster N that make that possible. So perhaps the biggest challenge for a front-wheel drive vehicle is acceleration, because what happens when you start accelerating is you transfer load from the front of the vehicle to the back of the vehicle. And of course, only those front tires are what you can accelerate with. And so as you increase your acceleration, you remove load from the wheels that are actually doing the accelerating, so you can accelerate less. And so you'll often hear, for example, that 50-50 is like the ideal weight balance for a vehicle. But for a front-wheel drive vehicle, that can be a challenge, because that means once you start accelerating, most of your weight is on the back, and thus you're not going to have good acceleration numbers. So actually having that engine up front, having that front layout is helpful for front-wheel drive vehicles when the engine is up there, because you have that weight over them, and thus you can accelerate better with more of the weight front-centered. And so, for example, this Veloster N is capable of accelerating at 0.6 Gs, which is a very good number for a front-wheel drive vehicle. Now, the other big challenge with front-wheel drive is, of course, that the front tires are doing almost all of the work. So it's, of course, responsible for your steering. It's the only axle with steering in this case. And so it has to do all the turning for the vehicle. It also has to do the accelerating for the vehicle as it's front-wheel drive. And, of course, during braking, most of the weight is on that front axle. So in all, forms of performance, accelerating, braking, cornering, that front axle is extremely important. And so it's doing all the work. And putting all that work onto one axle can be challenging. So one of the ways to alleviate that challenge is by using a limited slip differential. And in this case, Hyundai uses an electronic limited slip differential. So as you're accelerating out of a corner, if you're cornering, well, you have load transfer to the outside tire. And so that tire has more of the load on it and thus can use more of that grip to accelerate. So if you were to have an open differential, well, you can only split your torque evenly between the front axles. So if you're cornering really hard, then you're limited in how much torque you can put down by that inside tire, which doesn't have that much load on it and thus doesn't allow you to accelerate very hard. So when you start to lock up and force both tires to rotate at a similar speed, well, that allows you to transfer torque to the outside tire and thus put down more acceleration. Now, in the case of an electronic limited slip differential, what that means is you can choose how much you want that lockup to be. So you can allow for more torque transfer, depending on the scenario, to that outside wheel, or you can allow for less of it if you want it to have, a bit more rotation difference between the two wheels. Ultimately, though, what it means by having that electronic limited slip differential is coming out of a hard corner, you can actually accelerate faster just by using the differential. And it's like your grip hasn't really changed. You have the same tires, same setup, but because you're forcing more of the acceleration to go to the tire that has the load on it, you actually get to accelerate better with it. So it's a very clever solution, and using the electronic style where you can differ how much lockup you have between the two wheels means you can have the different modes, sport mode, normal mode, eco mode, N mode, where you vary how much actually you lock up between the two wheels. Now, another unique challenge to front-wheel drive vehicles is torque steer. So torque steer is where when you press your foot down on the throttle pedal, you actually turn, it forces the steering wheel to turn. The car actually wants to maneuver just from the torque going to the wheels. And of course, with a rear-wheel drive vehicle, you would never have that because the rear wheels don't actually steer for you. So it's a unique problem for front-wheel drive vehicles, and Hyundai actually believes a little bit is a good thing. So they actually allow for it to happen because they consider this to be part of a feedback, between the throttle and the driver. It's kind of giving you information. So as long as you can maintain that steering response and still have that, feedback in the steering wheel, they want you to still be able to feel, a little bit of that torque steer, a little bit of that power coming through the steering. Now, personally, I don't feel it all that much much when I put my foot down. So I think they've done a pretty good job of eliminating it, but they say that they do want to allow for a little bit of it in order for there to be that feedback to the driver. Now, another important part of a sports car is having response. You want things to happen when you ask for them, not have this delay. And so whether that's the throttle or the steering or the brakes, you want that response. And one of the clever things they've done with the brakes is if you're on the accelerator pedal hard and then you release, they immediately pre-fill the brakes so that the second you tap on that brake pedal, you have good brake pressure. There's no delay in waiting for it to start filling because it pre-fills that cylinder. Now, another challenge to sports cars, really all cars, but particularly sports cars, is cost. I mean, you have to pay for performance, right? And personally, I get more excited by these vehicles that are much more attainable than the, further end of the spectrum where you're into supercars and hypercars, where, for most people, it's not actually an attainable vehicle, versus this is, a much more attainable price tag. And going with a front engine, front wheel drive layout also simply helps with cost. I mean, there's less components overall versus rear wheel drive or all wheel drive, and you can help on cost by having just front wheel drive, front engine. And I think, making a car that's enjoyable to drive for the mass market rather than, this tiny market that can afford, exotic materials and all the extraordinary engineering that goes into, these super high-end performance cars, something that's genuinely fun for everybody to drive, I think is a way cooler achievement because it's difficult to do. It is a huge engineering challenge to make something very fun on a smaller budget. And that's something I respect so much about this vehicle because I feel like they've done it really well. I mean, it's an affordable price tag, and yet they've packed in all kinds of cool features with this thing. Electronic adjustable damping, electronic adjustable limited slip differential, turbocharged, you've got good power, and so, it's got a nice power to weight ratio. The vehicle overall about 3,100 pounds, so you get good acceleration from it, and yet all within this affordable price package, and I think that's fantastic. I think that's a much more respectable goal than just going after these huge, ridiculous, crazy numbers, but that, most people won't actually be able to get in and have fun with. Now, I think another interesting point about front-wheel drive cars that's often overlooked is if you have the engine up front, front-wheel drive versus rear-wheel drive, in bad weather conditions, you're able to extract more performance out of a front-wheel drive vehicle simply because you've got more weight over those driven wheels. So whether it's rain or snow or whatever it is, if you have more weight over your driven wheels, you're able to extract more performance out of it. You're able to accelerate more. So, sure, in the snow, your front-wheel drive is going to be spinning those tires. But that said, front-wheel drive versus rear-wheel drive, if the engine's up front and you're in a rear-wheel drive vehicle, well, you have even less grip to put down because of that weight distribution. So front-wheel drive, regardless of the condition, it allows you to push it a bit more, which is fun. Now, none of this is to say that there's anything wrong with rear-wheel drive. Rear-wheel drive cars are fantastic, and there is a joy associated with them. But I think a lot of elements of driving don't actually relate to what are the driven wheels. Sound is certainly a part of it. One of the cool things they've done with this is when you shift, they have a way where they retard the ignition timing, and so as a result, you have that pressure build up in the exhaust, and you get these nice crackles that come out of the exhaust, when you let off the throttle, and it has that ignition timing change so that you have that combustion occur, and it builds pressure within your exhaust, and that can actually be useful as a sort of anti-lag measure to keep your turbocharger spooling up. So, the way that a vehicle sounds, ultimately the amount of grip that a vehicle has, it's not super dependent on the, front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, all-wheel drive layout. Cornering grip is, going to come much more from the suspension setup, from the tires that are used, that sort of thing, rather than what are the driven wheels. So how do the shifts feel? What's the engine response like? What's the aerodynamics of the vehicle? These sorts of things aren't dependent on, the drivetrain layout. And overall, what I think Hyundai really nails with this vehicle is this sort of old school, fun driving feel, where it has all these modern, electronics and features and things, but the driving experience itself is this very raw, old school, fun feeling. It's not this super buttoned up, super refined experience. It's playful, and it wants you to toss it around, and that's what makes it fun and enjoyable to drive. You've got a good power, you've got a good weight to it, and you combine that with this playful nature, and it makes it super fun. My first car was actually a sporty little front-wheel drive hatchback, and I loved it. You know, you combine the low weight with decent power, and you can have a ton of fun in these things. And they pack it with, you know, the features. It's got rev matching, it's got those exhaust crackles, it's got plenty of torque, electronic limited slip differential. Overall, the package is very fun, and you know, I love that vehicles like this in the affordable price range exist that gives you the option, and whether it's front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, it's just an enjoyable experience. So a big thank you to Hyundai for sponsoring this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below.